today. And as we read this, it's like a flashlight moment for the world, a flashlight moment for the world as to, what to do, that there is still work to do, to carry on working. And a little bit of context, obviously we've got to this point through going one chapter at a time each week. And last week we had the Good Shepherd, and that Jesus is the Good Shepherd and he's also the gate, but we can know him. The revelation is that we can know God personally. He isn't a distant God. He isn't a far off God. He's a God that we can personally know. And that was on the back of chapter 9, where the man that was born blind was healed. Born blind and healed. And that man had a progressive revelation of who Jesus was, because at first he called him the man, and then he called him the prophet, and then he said, Lord, I believe. So it's as though his eyes were being opened. And in a similar way, this passage in chapter 11 with Lazarus is like that. We are progressively seeing who Jesus is. He is the resurrection and the life. All life comes through him, and only resurrection comes through him. At the end of chapter 10, it talks about John the Baptist, when Jesus fled isn't quite the right word, but escaped perhaps from the people that were pursuing him, and he went to the region of John the Baptist. And John puts this there particularly because, remember, back in chapter 1 we talked about the literary tools that John uses, and one of them is called an inclusio, and it's like where he bookmarks things. So in chapter 1 we hear that John the Baptist is on the scene, and that's the start of John's gospel about Jesus. And then at the end of chapter 10 we have the area of John the Baptist comes up once again. So John is framing that section of the Gospel of John within those two statements. There's another thing that we need to be aware of, and I've mentioned it before. The whole Gospel is split up into 4. It's the proclamation of the kingdom and the proclamation of the king, and then the rejection of the king and the rejection of the kingdom. So as this section stops with this big inclusio and ends at the end of chapter 10, we now enter a new phase, which is the rejection of the king, the rejection of Jesus. Even though he does all these wonderful miracles, people still reject him. It's hard to believe. But, if Jesus was around today, we would still do the same thing. There would still be people that would reject him today. Let's read chapter 11. I'm not going to read the whole of chapter 11, just up to 46, I think it is. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that the Son may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha answered, "I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was come into the world." And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, now noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out. His hands and feet were wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. It's a great narrative, this one. The characters come out. And sometimes you've got to read it in a sense where you get who these people are. You know, Martha comes across as actually quite controlling. And she doesn't answer the questions that Jesus asks. She indirectly answers them, and actually by doing that shows that she doesn't really have the faith and understanding that her sister does. Her sister Mary comes to Jesus with worship. Lord, she says to him. This is perhaps the most dramatic miracle in the Gospel of John, the healing and resurrection of Lazarus. And for some people, it's a difficult thing to believe, how Jesus could raise somebody from the dead. But if you believe that Jesus is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and he came back and was resurrected himself, if you believe that, then surely believing that Lazarus was raised from the dead is that much easier. If you can believe that Jesus is the Christ and Messiah, the resurrected one, who will one day come again, if you can believe that huge camel, why strain out the gnat of Lazarus? The miracle of Lazarus, I believe, is a real miracle, a true one. Jesus did resurrect him from the dead, give him life back. And John puts in his gospel these details that help us to understand the picture. He names the people and he also names the places. This isn't an abstract story. He even says about Mary wiping the feet of Jesus with her hair, which actually he hasn't written about here, but he's going to write about later on. It's as though, if you think about it, John is writing the gospel after the fact of it all happening. And the story about Mary wiping Jesus' feet with her hair was a well-known story. So he's telling his readers, you know the story about Mary? Well, this is the same Mary, you know, the one who was sister of Lazarus and Martha. And John puts these details in to make it real. I've got the first clip that comes up, the first slide. Really interesting. In 1873, a man called Effendi Saud, who lived on the outskirts of the Mount of Olives by Bethany, he was digging some earth because he was doing some building work, and he came across this cave. And when he investigated a bit more, he discovered that this cave became a tomb. And when they looked inside, they found all these ossuaries. Now, that is what an ossuary is. They're a small stone box, normally made out of limestone. Because what they did, and it was only for a short period of time, actually, maybe for 50 years before the birth of Christ, up to maybe AD 200, they made ossuaries. They've never made them before. They've never made them since. It was just in that period of time. So they're quite a unique picture into history. And ossuaries were for the purpose of putting bones in. So when somebody was buried, they would put them in the tomb. And then a couple of years later, what they would do is that they would collect their bones together and put them in an ossuary. And these are only small things. They're only kind of like, a foot and a half by 10 inches, something like that, small box. And they would line all the bones in there of the people. And in this tomb, just outside Bethany, happens to be 30 of these ossuaries, and they have their names on them. And on their names, on 3 of them, are Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, along with, it so happens, 27 other names of people that are mentioned in the New Testament. It's a fascinating archaeological discovery that really brings to light that these people were real people. These things really happened. The Mount of Olives isn't too far from Jerusalem. And the next clip gives us a bit more detail about where we're looking at. So that's Bethany there, where the red dot is, and that's Jerusalem. It's only a couple of miles difference. You can walk there. It's about the same distance as Lewes to Ringmer. It's not that far. So it was quite an easy walk, really. And Lazarus and his family were a well-known family. They were so well known that people from Jerusalem came to mourn with Mary and Martha. Jesus says, when he hears the news, that he's not going to go there. And that was a bit shocking for people, for the disciples, because they knew that he loved Lazarus. So why didn't he just get up and go right immediately? Well, from where he was, where John was, that we also get that location in the valley with the Jordan, it was probably about a 2-day walk. So he heard the news on day 1, waited, walked for 2 days, and then got there. So 4 days in all by the time he got there. And they didn't want him to go in the first place. Some of the disciples said, look, if you're going to go back there, Jesus, you know what's going to happen. You're going to get arrested and they're going to stone you. And this is where we see that Jesus actually is in control of the situation. Because he knows what's going to happen and he goes towards it. He knows exactly what the outcome is going to be, and he doesn't shy away from it. He is in control of the situation. It's his purpose, his plan, and he's sticking to it. The disciples don't fully know it, and good old Thomas speaks up and says, look, if Jesus is going to die, then I'm going to go and die with him, which is very brave, but he doesn't quite understand that Jesus is also the resurrection. Yes, he's going to die. We're all going to die. But if you put your faith in Jesus, you're going to be resurrected as well. We're going to be with him one day. We won't need a grave. We won't need an ossuary. What we'll need is new clothes when we go to be with Jesus. And the touching, loving, compassionate Jesus is written about by John here when he talks about his relationship with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He loved them. And that most poignant of words, 2 words, Jesus wept, comes out in this passage. Mary and Martha and Lazarus weren't apostles, but Jesus loved them. Like us, we are not all apostles like that, but Jesus loves us. We're not all prime ministers and generals and, surgeons, other great things in life. We're not all fantastically great achievers, but Jesus loves us. And we know that because we can see that he loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. He loved them. He loved their faith. It was a reciprocal love. He loved them. They loved him. And Jesus knew that Lazarus's death would not be permanent. He says that the work of God will be displayed, revealed by what Jesus does. And it's a bit like why the man was born blind. Because as a result of his blindness, the glory of God was revealed. And as a result of Lazarus dying, the glory of God is revealed. We see that Jesus has the power over life and death and resurrection. He's not callous and uncaring, but wanting to prove for everyone in history who he is and what he can do. And if he can do it for Lazarus, he can do it for you and me as well. This is for the glory of God. It's for the glory of Jesus. It's for the good of Lazarus. It's for the good of Lazarus's family and friends. It's for the good of the disciples. And it's for the good of all of us that we know that Jesus can resurrect people from the dead. And Lazarus had to be dead for that a length of time for people to understand that this isn't a misinterpretation. He was, properly dead. The Bible says he was properly dead, dead as in sealed in the tomb dead, with all the grave clothes on him. Not just in a coma or something like that, but really dead. The Bible makes that clear. And it can't be misinterpreted. And through that, you can just imagine what the disciples were thinking, what their faith would have been like. And they needed to have a strong faith because they were going to go through a lot. Their lives were going to be very testing, and their faith needed to be strengthened a lot. And this would have just catapulted their faith. Imagine that. I don't know, if you think about it for a few moments, what is the most wonderful thing that you've ever seen? God's miracles, whatever that might be. Could be the birth of a child or some other type of miracle, a healing perhaps, I don't know. And when you see those things, they really encourage your faith. And that's not to say that faith, sight-based signs are the best way to increase your faith, but it's better to have that than no faith at all. They try and warn him about going, even though Lazarus is going to be raised. And one of the things that Jesus says to them is about the daylight. 12 hours of daylight, you do your work in the 12 hours, and you can walk by that light in the daytime and not stumble. But for Jesus, his ministry is coming now at this point in the gospel to the twilight. But there is still work to do. And Lazarus is a flashlight moment for us. I'm coming to the twilight times of my ministry and life. I've got less years ahead of me than I have behind me. That's just the truth of it. But there is still work to do. There's no point giving up now. The light is still on. There was a man called Frederick Green, and in 1994, there was a neighbour of his that noticed that there was a lot of post piled up outside his door. So he went in to see, and Frederick was on the floor, and he touched him, and he was cold, and he couldn't feel a pulse, and it was a bit smelly, and it just wasn't very nice. So he phoned the police, and the police phoned the coroner's court, the coroner's office. This is in California, and the coroner's technician came and took a photograph of Frederick's body on the ground. And as soon as the flash went off, Frederick had a sigh. Sometimes we need a flashlight moment in our lives to realize that there is still work to do. What is the flashlight moment for you? We've got a couple of questions that are going to come up on the screen, and they're also on your table. You might have had a flashlight moment in the past. Something that has said to you, there's still work to do. Still carry on. While it's still light, what work for Jesus do you want to do? So just discuss those things on your table. There might be something that you have burning in your heart that you really want to do for Jesus. And have a talk about that. Because there's still time. You can still do it. We'll do that. We'll talk amongst yourselves for 5 minutes, and then we'll have some communion.